Hey guys, welcome to a new video. Like, comment and subscribe if you enjoy. Without any further interruptions, enjoy the what if. 11. Sailing with the Going Merry. This is the Going Merry. Do you like it? Asked Merry, trusted servant of Kaya. You're giving it to us? Asked Zoro. Kaya nodded. Of course. You saved our village and our lives. It's the least I could do. Besides, I don't really need a ship. Kaya explained. Luffy looked at the ship in wonder. Merry, it's great to see you again. Luffy thought, and undamaged. Then his face fell as he remembered what happened to it, but then he smiled. You may not be able to go with us to the New World, but I'll make sure you get us to Water 7 safely. Arigato. He then said simply. I love it. Kaya just smiled. Then she heard some commotion and turned around. She saw Usopp rolling down the hill with a huge backpack. When he almost reached the sea, Zoro and Luffy stopped him with his feet, but unfortunately they hit his face. Thanks. Usopp mumbled, touching the giant bump on his face. Luffy and Zoro jumped on the ship, while Nami was already on it. Anyway guys, see you someday on the sea. We may be friends, but when we meet, Usopp tried to say. What are you going on about? Interrupted Luffy. Get on, yelled a smirking Zoro. Usopp mumbled something under his breath while giving a surprised face. Kaya and Merry just laughed. We're already nakama, said Luffy. Come with us. Usopp's eyes bulged out in surprise, but he lifted his arm. I'm the captain, he yelled out. Only if you beat me in a duel, said Luffy. Zoro laughed loudly as Usopp's face fell. Vice captain then, he yelled out again. Luffy shook his head. That's Zoro, he told Usopp, and they all laughed as his face fell again. But you can be our sniper and inventor. And you can replace Zoro when he's asleep, which is pretty much all the time. Oi, yelled Zoro, trying to appear angry, but he couldn't hide his smile. He boarded the ship and they all waved to Kaya, Merry and the three kids, who were on top of the hill. Do you think he'll be okay? One of them asked. I'm sure he will, said another. He's Captain Usopp after all. The third smiled and nodded. Even so, I'm glad he's with those powerful guys, he said. After a few minutes of sailing, the Straw Hat Pirates were finally officially formed again as Usopp painted their Jolly Roger for the first time again. However, after painting the sail, Luffy gave him a few black flags and ordered him to repeat his work. Needless to say, Usopp was pretty exhausted that day. At night, a few hours later, Nami had watch duty. Usopp and Zoro were in the men's quarters sleeping, while Luffy fell asleep next to her and someone covered him with a blanket. Nothing was happening, but then she heard Luffy mumbling in his sleep. No, not again. He mumbled. Stop it. Get away from them, Akainu. Akainu, she thought. That name sounds familiar. No, don't come near my brother. He mumbled while trashing around, fighting invisible enemies. No, Ace. Luffy suddenly screamed, scaring her half to death, but then he woke up in cold sweat. He started looking around and had an absolutely terrified look on his face, unlike anything else she saw on his face. He was always composed and smiling, he always had a look of absolute confidence, but now he looked like his world has just crashed down around him. He seemed so broken. After a few moments he calmed himself, not noticing her. He was on lookout duty during the day and after that he fell asleep up there and they didn't move him. Who's Ace? She asked and he yelped, not expecting it. Oh Nami, you scared me, he mumbled. Who's Ace, Luffy? Nami asked again. Luffy sighed. Ace is my brother, Luffy answered after a few moments. Is he a pirate? She asked, genuinely interested. Luffy nodded. Ace is the 2nd Division commander of the Whitebeard Pirates, he told her. Her eyes bulged out in shock. Whitebeard, you mean Great Pirate Whitebeard? She asked. He simply nodded. She wanted to ask something else, but Luffy beat her to it with words of his own. I know what you're planning, he told her, and upon hearing those words she paled and started sweating. What are you talking about, Luffy? She said, trying to appear innocent, but it was obvious it didn't work too well. I saw your mark, Luffy said quietly, and her eyes widened and she stood up abruptly. She wanted to say something, anything, to stop this conversation, but no words would come to her, as she was too nervous under his watchful gaze. Then she touched her shoulder, where the tattoo was. "It's obvious you hate him," he continued. "But you must be trapped somehow. Does he have your family?" She didn't say again, but she lowered her head and he could see a tear slipping down her face. He sighed. "Take the ship," he suddenly said. She lifted her head and looked at him like he grew another head. Excuse me," she asked. "You're collecting money, right?" He asked and she nodded. "I've put on this ship half of my money, which is 6.000.000 berry." Her eyes widened. "That will be enough," she thought. "I'll have the 100 million now." He sighed again. "Take the ship, take the money and give it to him. Get your family back," he said to her. "We'll follow you. If he betrays you, I'll kick his ass." During the day, a few hours later. "Hey Usopp, can you hit that giant rock with the cannon?" Luffy asked and motioned toward the rock, which was the size of a small island. "Yosh," Usopp proclaimed and took his captain's stance. He lit the cannon and hit the rock with the first try. He was somewhat surprised at this himself, but he soon forgot about that when they heard screaming. "Hey guys," Luffy yelled, "let's go over there to that rock." Someone screamed. They obeyed and tried to bring the ship close, but their thought process was interrupted when someone, namely Johnny, jumped on the ship and tried to slash Luffy. When he was just about to destroy a part of the fence, Luffy punched him, sending him toward the mast. He really didn't want Mary to get damaged so soon, even if it was just a fence. Johnny picked himself up. Luffy didn't use too much power, and lifted his katana again when Zoro called out to him. Johnny recognized him and finally calmed down. Then Nami fixed his partner Yosaku's scurvy problem, and in gratitude, the duo promised to treat them at the floating restaurant while also mentioning that Dracula Mahawk was sighted somewhere nearby. They left for the restaurant. 12. Don't mess with a cook of the sea. Who's the captain of this ship? A pink-haired man in a white striped suit asked. Luffy stepped forward. I'm Monkey D. Luffy, captain of the Straw Hat Pirates. The man seemed unimpressed. Your ship is an eyesore. Sink them, he announced, and one of his men loaded the side cannon. He lit the fuse and fired. Luffy jumped in front of the cannonball. Gomu Gomu no Fusen, he yelled and became a balloon. He caught the ball with his enlarged body and threw it back at them. The cannonball flew past the mast, missing it barely. Full Body seemed shocked. If you try that again, I'm sinking you, Luffy announced in a casual tone as he hit the ground. He pointed toward the Baratie. Get us there, guys. I'm hungry. He went past Nami, who looked at him with uncertainty. Wait for the enemy to appear, he whispered in her ear. She nodded. With that they approached the restaurant. After securing the ship, they left one of the two bounty hunters guarding it. Luffy eyed the marine vessel suspiciously, but the annoying marine lieutenant made no move to attack, no doubt scared. Even so, he did not change his course and still headed for the restaurant. Luffy sighed in relief when Full Body exited the ship and headed to the restaurant entrance. When the door closed behind him, Luffy and the group followed. For the special occasion, you don't recruit such an excellent cook twice. Luffy wore a red captain's cloak, very similar to the one Gold Roger once wore, on top of his cardigan. He opened the door and entered, followed by Johnny, who was there to treat them, as well as the rest of his nakama. When he entered, all attention shifted to him for some reason for a moment. It may have been his powerful aura, but Luffy didn't particularly care at this point. Johnny pointed to an empty table and Luffy shrugged and went there. They waited for a few moments and then he arrived. Sanji. Flashback. Fine, shitty captain, I'll make you some meat, just make sure you take this to Nami Swan and Robin Kwan, Sanji said and handed him a platter with delicious-looking snacks. He eyed the snacks longingly and looked at Sanji. He sighed. I'm sure the ladies will give you some. Just ask them first. Luffy nodded and smiled. The best cook in the world, Luffy thought and almost teared up. Sanji looked at him and sighed in irritation. What do you want to order? He asked in an annoyed tone. Meat, Luffy practically screamed. Sanji looked at him wide-eyed, not knowing whether to laugh, sigh or slap the bastard. He settled for the second. Give me lots of meat, Luffy repeated. Sanji nodded and murmured an insult under his breath. He turned to the rest of them and noticed Nami, and his visible eye immediately turned into a heart. "Ah, what beauty," he sang out and kissed her hand. "I think I'm in love. What is your name, oh beautiful lady?" "It's Nami," said orange-haired navigator answered. "I'm Sanji, my love," he proclaimed while dancing around her in his love-induced state. Patty and another cook in the background both sighed and face-palmed. "So what can I get you?" Sanji asked. "Just a light treat, something with fruit," she answered. "And I'd really appreciate it if I didn't have to pay." "Hi, Nami-san, I can't really ask such a beauty to pay," he answered. She smiled sweetly. He turned to the rest of them and his demeanor changed considerably. "What do you shitheads want?" he asked. They were taken aback by his rudeness, but nonetheless started to order things. "Hey Sanji," a childish voice called after he took all the orders. "Bring me meat soon, okay?" Sanji almost bit his cigarette in half in irritation. A few minutes later, Sanji walked to the table alongside two other cooks. They brought lots of meat for Luffy as well as takoyaki for Johnny, some sake and sushi for Zoro, a big sandwich for Usopp and a fruit treat for Nami, which he proceeded to put in front of her along with a rose. He was then interrupted from his noodle dance by an annoying costumer. "Hey waiter," Full Body called, unaware of how dangerous it was to annoy a sea cook. Sanji sighed and excused himself from the table and stomped irritated toward the marine lieutenant. "Like I said before, I'm not a waiter, I'm a cook," he said to the man, but his words were completely ignored as the man motioned toward his dish. "Hey, does this restaurant serve bug soup or something?" the man said. "Huh?" Sanji asked. "Bugs." Full Body punched the table lightly. "Then what is this bug in my soup?" he asked and pointed toward the bug in his soup. Sanji's lip twitched slightly. He couldn't resist it. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't know," Sanji replied smugly. "I'm not much of an expert on bugs myself." The entire restaurant was listening to their conversation, and with those words many started to snicker in amusement, including Full Body's date. Luffy laughed loudly in the background. "Nice one, Sanji," he complimented. Even though Luffy wasn't a pretty lady, Sanji couldn't help but smirk proudly. Full Body of course was in rage, and he stood up abruptly and punched the table, destroying it and the plates, spilling the soup, the wine and pissing off a sea cook. "Uh-oh," Luffy thought as Sanji's eyes darkened. "Can money fill your stomach?" Sanji asked suddenly. Full Body had a confused expression. "I said," Sanji asked again. "Can money fill your stomach?" Luffy watched amused as his future cook kicked the crap out of an arrogant marine officer. Then he held him by the neck, bloodied as he was. "Messing with a cook of the sea is a good way to get yourself killed, shitty marine," Sanji growled. Flashback. "Don't touch our long nose, shitty marine." It was good to see Sanji again. "Hey guys," Luffy said, getting the attention of his three crewmates. "I think that's our cook." He grinned. He heard Zoro mutter a curse under his breath. Then they were all interrupted from their thoughts as several cooks arrived on the scene and got Sanji off Full Body and restrained him as the idiotic marine continued to spew insults whilst being scared half to death by the restrained cook. "Fighting again in my restaurant, bloody ingrate," a voice said. Sanji calmed down somewhat. "Owner Zeph." Finally, the owner, Full Body thought, finally someone sen. He was interrupted from his thoughts by a kick with a wooden leg. "You're another one," the owner yelled. "Get lost, brat." "Even the owner," Full Body roared. "Even the owner of this crazy place doesn't respect his costumer. You won't get away with this." Then, he and the fuming Sanji, who once again had to be restrained by the chefs, were interrupted by another voice. "Lieutenant Full Body, sir," yelled a marine and saluted. Full Body turned around. "What is it?" he seethed. The marine seemed frightened. "Sir, the prisoner has escaped," yelled the marine. Full Body's eyes widened. He took out most of the guards. "When I left." A gunshot pierced his chest. The marine fell down on the ground. A few costumers screamed. Behind him was a pale-looking man who looked like he didn't sleep for a month. He nonchalantly stepped over the fallen marine and went to the nearest empty table and sat down. All eyes were on him. He looked around. "Bring me some food," he yelled. "This is a restaurant, isn't it?" "Oh, a costumer," Patty yelled out in joy. Apart from that, everything stayed quiet. Full Body silently dragged himself toward the exit as the attention was no longer on him. Patty stepped in front of Jin and asked him if he has any money. Jin asked if a bullet was okay and Patty responded by slamming him into the ground and throwing him out, earning cheers from most cooks as well as costumers. The commotion was over and the cooks went to their respective workplaces. Luffy noticed how Sanji lingered on a bit, but then followed them and returned quickly, with a place of food and then stepped outside. Luffy followed him. Luffy stepped outside and watched what would happen. Jin lay on the deck on his stomach, muttering silent curses. Sanji placed the plate of food in front of him. Jin refused at first, but Sanji convinced him otherwise by telling him that by eating today he would be able to see tomorrow. Jin started to eat and was so moved by the kindness that he started to cry. Sanji finally noticed the man behind him. "And you?" he asked. "What do you want?" Luffy shrugged. "I was curious what you'd do." Sanji lighted himself a smoke. "When you're alone at sea and have nothing to eat or drink, it's terrible," he started. "It's the most terrible feeling in the world. That's why I can't stand to see someone starving. Even if the old geezer fires me I still won't stand for it." They stood there silently watching the ocean for a few moments as Jin ate. When Jin was finally finished he put the plate on the ground. He looked up to Sanji. "What's your name?" he asked him. Sanji smiled softly before answering. "It's Sanji." "Thank you, Sanji-san. It was good," Jin said bowing his head. Sanji just grinned in response. Then Jin turned to Luffy, who was still looking at the sea. "I can't help but notice your coat. You're a pirate, aren't you?" "What's your name?" he asked him. Luffy nodded. "I am. My name is Monkey D. Luffy. I'm going to be the Pirate King," Luffy answered. The other man looked at him somewhat surprised by his words. "So you must be going to the Grand Line then, Jin asked after a few moments. Luffy nodded. "Listen, it isn't my place to prevent you from going, but I thought I should at least warn you. That place is a nightmare. But I have to go there," Luffy announced. "It's my dream. Shouldn't a man follow his dream?" Sanji looked struck deep by his words and Luffy noticed this, so he continued. "Besides, what was I supposed to do at home? Live from one day to the next? I'd prefer to do something more with my life, thanks." Jin couldn't begin to argue with those words. "Well, do what you like," he said and stood up. "As for me, I must return to my captain." Sanji then asked him who his captain was and Jin answered that it was Don Krieg. They talked some more and Sanji told him to take on the boats, which Jin happily did as he didn't have any other choice. Then Zeph appeared. "You gave him free food didn't you, Lil Eggplant?" Zeph asked in an annoyed tone. Sanji's eye twitched. "I'm sorry I got you in trouble, Sanji-san." Jin apologized. Sanji shook his head. "Jin, he started. "You didn't get him into trouble, Jin." Luffy interrupted and all three looked in his direction. "After all, you paid," he said in a smug tone, as he handed a few coins to the cook. Jin looked ready to thank him, but Luffy just grinned and waved his hand as if trying to hit a fly. They waved as his boat disappeared into the distance. Zeph went back into the kitchen wearing a small smile. Luffy turned to Sanji. "Join my crew." Sanji stared at him for a moment. "I refuse. I have my own reasons to stay here," Sanji finally replied. Luffy put his head right into Sanji's face. "No, I refuse," he announced. "What?" Sanji asked bewildered. "I refuse your refusal." Sanji just stared. "You're a great cook, you can fight and I like you. You must join." Sanji looked ready to pull his hair out. "Hey, listen to me," Sanji almost yelled in frustration. "So what's your reason?" Luffy asked. "I don't need to tell you," yelled Sanji. "Can't resist," thought Luffy and his lips twitched a little. "But you told me to listen," he yelled. ARRRRRGGGG. 13. Foul play. Krieg and foul mood, Luffy. "My ship is a mess and I want a new one. Leave after you cook for my men and I won't hurt you. I won't guarantee the safety of anyone who stays behind," Don Krieg announced in an arrogant voice. Luffy sighed in annoyance, as he looked at the fallen figures of both Sanji and Jin, who were both laying wounded on the ground. Then he looked at the annoying face of Don Krieg, who was on the ground begging only moments ago until Sanji fed him, knowing full well what would probably happen after. He was the only one who remained seated. The cooks and costumers were all standing, keeping guard of any possible things Krieg might do. Zoro and Usopp stood on the balcony. Nami was on the ship, probably trying to get Yosaku and Johnny off it. Then Krieg ordered the cooks to give him food for 100 people, who were starving on his barely standing ship. Sanji complied and the cooks confronted him, tried to stop him, calling him Krieg's lackey. They probably thought he was afraid of him, but Luffy knew better. Sanji wasn't a man who would fear another man easily or at all. Then Patty punched Sanji to the ground and tried to take out Krieg with a handheld cannon, which of course didn't work too well. Krieg then finally revealed the reason he was any good of a pirate even if he wasn't, and that was his gold-colored metal armor with 100 weapons in it. Frankie is much cooler, Luffy thought. Then Krieg started talking about how his word is law and how everyone must obey him if they want to live. Luffy rolled his eyes in irritation. It's not that his tolerance for such people was that low. He was surprisingly patient with people, given his impulsive and reckless personality. But he wasn't really having a very good day. Flashback, last night, Luffy was in a cell, his hands and feet bound by seastone cuffs and connected with the wall, giving him very little space to move. Then he heard chuckling. First it was faint, then it grew louder and louder. Luffy stiffened as he recognized the voice. He heard the door open. A man entered the cell. Luffy looked up. Well, Dragon's son. Admiral Sakazuki said in a sarcastic tone. You're looking well today, aren't you, Mugiwara? Luffy just stared back at him with a scowl. He chuckled. Don't look at me like that now, Mugiwara no Luffy. I have a present for you today, he said with a creepy grin. Luffy's eyes widened. He knew something horrible was about to happen. 2 Marines entered the cell and got his off the wall, but kept his cuffs on of course. Luffy struggled when they forced him to walk, but it wasn't enough. They traveled a long corridor and when they got outside, Luffy noticed the familiar surroundings. There were Marines everywhere and as he walked they snarled at him, laughed, cursed his name, insulted his friends and whatever horrible thing they could imagine. Then Luffy noticed why the place seemed familiar. He saw the Ox Bell. This was Marineford. He screamed, but his screams were muffled. He had cloth in his mouth. Then they stopped. Sakazuki turned around and grinned. He pointed somewhere. Luffy followed his finger. What he saw horrified him. There were 10 people kneeling on the floor, cuffed. Then Akainu walked towards them slowly. Luffy tried to run to stop him, but he was held back by many Marines. He tried to scream, but nothing would come out except muffled sounds. Akainu reached the first person. It was Ace. His fist turned into lava. Luffy tried extra hard to do anything that could help his brother, but he couldn't do nothing. A magma fist ran through the body of Ace and came out of his bare chest. Luffy's eyes widened. His mind screamed. He failed again. He looked at Ace's face. I'm sorry, my brother. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. He whispered and Luffy barely heard him. No, AC. Luffy's mind screamed. Luffy, someone close to him said. Luffy looked around and saw nobody familiar. Akainu walked toward him and pulled the gag out his mouth. Why are you doing this? Luffy screamed at him. Akainu just chuckled. Luffy, another voice close by said. Again no one. Why not just kill me? If you're going to kill them then kill me as well. He screamed on top of his lungs. Akainu chuckled. Luffy, a voice screamed this time. It sounded kind of like Zoro, but Zoro was over there on the ground, on his knees. Luffy was sure he was losing it. Akainu started laughing. Oh no, Dragon's son. You're not going to die. Akainu said in a low threatening tone. I'll make sure of that. You'll watch as everyone else you care about dies. But you'll live. Luffy looked at him in absolute horror. Luffy. Again a voice screamed. Sakazuki laughed once again. That's your punishment, Monkey D. Luffy. For the sin of being born. Akainu walked back to the prisoners chuckling to himself all the while, already turning his fist into magma and Luffy screamed, unrestrained. Luffy. Usopp yelled. He felt pain on his cheek. Then he woke up. He was completely covered in sweat. He looked around, terrified. He saw the faces of his 2 male nakama staring at him worried. He put a hand on his chest. His heart was beating fast. He ignored the questions of his friends. In fact, he almost didn't hear them. All he could hear was the constant chuckling of the admiral. Needless to say, he did not sleep even a minute more that night. You see, this armor is tougher than anything. It can withstand anything. Don't mess with the East Blue's greatest, Don K. Would you just shut up? Luffy interrupted. Everyone looked at him in shock, including Krieg. I didn't have any freakin' sleep in 2 days and now I have to listen to this stupid crap. Luffy yelled. Just shut the hell up and go back to your stupid ship, Don Kling or whatever the hell your name is, jerk. Sanji blinked. This was totally different from yesterday, when Luffy was practically jumping around in joy. Luffy stood up, ignoring their shocked stares, and walked up to another table, picked up a glass of water and spilled it on his head, then casually walked back to his table and plopped in his seat. In the corner of his eye he could see Zoro smirking. He looked to Krieg. He could practically see the tick forming above his eye as he turned more and more red in anger. Then he exploded. You brat, how dare you disrespect me, the great Don Krieg? He yelled out in rage. He took a deep breath. But I guess it can't be helped, he said in a calmer tone with a smirk. One could see he was still mad, though. You're too ignorant for your own good, brat. I'm Don Krieg, I'm the strongest man there is. Luffy smirked. Really, Don Cribs? He asked in a childish-sounding tone, saying the name wrong on purpose. I think you're the ignorant one. Haven't you ever heard about Whitebeard? He could hear a few of the cooks fail to suppress a snicker. Sanji chuckled. Then Zeph arrived, and before Krieg could do anything else, he put a giant bag in front of him. Krieg gaped at him in confusion, the anger slowly leaving his face as he faced the owner. That's food for 100 men. Zeph clarified and turned around. Take it and leave. Then Krieg realized that Zeph was in fact Red Leg. Zeph, a pirate famous for his leg fighting style. Luffy watched in irritation as Krieg mocked Zeph for losing his leg and becoming a pirate because of that, and Zeph denied that. Then Krieg demanded his ship log and Zeph blew him off, telling him he didn't deserve it. When I come back, I want the ship and the log, Krieg announced loudly. Leave if you wish to survive. Owner Zeph, a cook exclaimed as Zeph and Krieg both prepared to leave. Why did you give him the food? Now they'll attack our restaurant. Zeph turned around. Only if they have the courage. Right, Mr. couldn't get through the Grand Line. Zeph replied. Everyone gasped. Krieg gritted his teeth. Even Don Krieg failed. Someone whispered. True, I couldn't get through. Krieg began. But I'm Don Krieg and I'm the greatest. I had enough men and ambition. All I lacked was information. Luffy chuckled lightly. Jin begun to shake and cover his face. But when I get that journal, I'll have that. And then I'll become the Pirate King, he announced. There was silence for a moment. Then everyone was startled by roaring laughter. Everyone turned to the only seated person on the ship and stared. The laughter calmed a bit and Luffy turned to face Krieg. You know, I never said I'd give you my future title, Luffy told him. Krieg snapped. That's not funny, boy. It may have been just the lack of information, but even my fleet only lasted 7 days, Krieg announced. Everyone gasped in disbelief, but the mocking smirk on Luffy's face didn't fade. So, who did you piss off? He asked. Krieg turned around to leave. Like I said before, you'd better leave if you want to survive, he said and exited. Then the cooks talked about why Zeph gave them food. Afterward Zeph told them to better leave, but none of them would. The customers left immediately after Krieg was gone. Then Jin talked about how great his captain was and how they should all escape. Then the conversation started about the Grand Line and Jin told them who was responsible for it. Zoro was on edge. You may have disturbed his nap, Zeph said. Jin growled. That's not funny, he muttered. Then Luffy stood up, gaining the attention of everyone, since he was quiet during the whole conversation. Eyes followed him as he walked to the entrance. He looked to the right and saw Nami throwing the 2 bounty hunters overboard. He smirked. Then he looked ahead. Krieg was just giving a speech to his men. Suddenly, he felt a powerful aura. He's here, he said. The cooks and Straw Hats looked at him in confusion. Who's here, Luffy? Asked Zoro. Luffy turned around and faced them. Dracula Mahawk, he said simply. He's come to hunt his prey. Then the ship behind him fell apart in 2. He looked at Zoro, who had his hand on his swords. Flashback. Will you fight him? Luffy asked. Yes, even if I have no chance like you say, I still want to follow my dream. Don't interfere, Zoro answered. He sighed and nodded. Fine. He heard Yosaku and Johnny yelling outside. Damn, he cursed. I'm not in the mood for all this. 14. Sir Dracula Mihawk, Royal Shichibukai. You know, I'm not one of those idiots who would hunt rabbits using their awl. Dracula Mihawk mocked as he took his cross-shaped pendant and opened it, revealing a tiny knife. Zoro gritted his teeth, angered at the blatant disrespect the swordsman showed. Luffy too was angered by the Shichibukai, but decided to let it go, as Mihawk was probably just tired of random no-name swordsmen who constantly challenged him, much to his annoyance. Mihawk and Zoro stood on the remains of Don Krieg's ship. Behind Mihawk was his small coffin-shaped boat. Luffy wondered how Mihawk navigated the Grand Line using that, but soon forgot about that, when Zoro started his attack. He could see all movements clearly, but Zoro could not. He used the very best of his techniques, but Mihawk stopped every single attempt quite easily with his tiny dagger. Zoro was fuming and let his anger control him, which made everything worse. The great swordsman continued to mock Zoro with both words and actions. Then he struck. Zoro looked down and saw the knife in his chest. A little bit deeper and the blade would take his life. Mihawk asked him why he fought. Zoro answered. He asked why he refused to step back, and Zoro answered that question as well. The warlord took the little blade out and put it back where it belonged. Luffy noticed that something changed in Mihawk's aura. The swordsman acknowledged Zoro's potential, just as Whitebeard acknowledged his during the Great War after Luffy revealed his Haoshoku haki. The swordsman unsheathed his black blade from his back. Kid, tell me your name, he asked. Roronoa Zoro. He complied. Mihawk smiled, a genuine for the first time since he arrived. I'll remember that. As a gesture to a fellow swordsman, I'll use my true weapon, this black blade, to end your life, he said. Luffy knew that Mihawk wouldn't kill Zoro, but still he could barely restrain himself. He also had to restrain two other foolish swordsmen, who constantly wanted to jump in. He could also see Mihawk eyeing him a few times for some reason. The swordsmen clashed. Mihawk emerged completely unharmed. Zoro's two regular blades cracked and fell apart. He got a big cut on his chest. I lost. Just like Luffy said I would, he said and smiled without a grudge. Mihawk's eyes widened. Luffy, why does that name sound familiar? Zoro sheathed his sword and turned around. What are you doing? Mihawk asked. Zoro smirked. Attacking from behind is a shameless act among swordsmen. And then he cut him. Blood flowed freely. Zoro's blood. Flashback. Luffy ran across the deck, trying to find anyone alive. Zoro was on the grass deck, clutching his Wado Ikimonji with his right hand. His body was almost entirely covered in burns. The grass was covered with dead marines, most of whom looked powerful. Among them, Luffy recognized 3 vice admirals. The grass was covered in blood. Zoro's face was almost the only part of his body that was not burned. It was covered in blood. Johnny and Yosaku had jumped in the water. Sanji yelled something to Zoro about his foolish ambition. Mihawk was sheathing his sword, but then he turned in the direction of the restaurant. He felt one of the most terrifying auras he had ever felt approaching him, fully intent on ending his life. Luffy was seeing red. Seeing Zoro get cut by the great swordsman made something inside him snap. He forgot his memory. He swung his katana. It crashed with Mihawk's giant sword, which the great swordsman unsheathed just in time. When the swords clashed, air exploded. The resulting shockwave sent most of the cooks flying back into the restaurant and many pirates into the sea. Usopp was on his butt being pushed into the wall on the deck of Baratie, staring shocked at the scene. The 3 figures that didn't move were Krieg, Sanji and Zeph. Amongst them, Krieg had the least difficulty in doing that and hid his shock behind an unconvincing smirk. As the 2 fighters struggled against each other, the glass windows at the front of Baratie shattered. The wood beneath the fighters cried like it was in the worst kind of storm, and tiny cracks started to appear. Zeph pointed toward something with his spare hand, while using his other one to shield his face. Sanji looked where his finger pointed and thought he was losing it. The clouds, which were abundant in the sky that day, have parted above the two fighters. Finally, the pressure dropped as each of the fighters jumped back. That wasn't the end, however, as immediately upon touching the ground, Luffy threw himself on Mihawk again. Each time their swords hit, it felt like an explosion. Luffy didn't limit himself to using just his swords, however. Using his devil fruit, Luffy used his legs and his free hand to try to get a hit on Mihawk. The Shichibukai noted this. This man is no swordsman. He seems to be primarily a user of free fighting style, he thought as he fended off his opponent's strikes. The attacks were no doubt powerful, but being on the defensive, Mihawk had no trouble defending against most of them. Then they heard violent loud coughing. Luffy jumped back and looked to his right. He saw Zoro being held above water by both of the pirate hunters. He looked back at Mihawk. His opponent noted that his eyes then lost all of their ferocity and rage. The only thing visible on his face was relief. This man, Mihawk thought to himself. It's him. There's no other explanation. It must be him. Both of the fighters sheathed their swords. Is Zoro okay? Luffy asked as the two dragged his swordsman to the boat. They confirmed he was going to be okay and started treating his words. Mihawk stepped in the direction of the boat. It's still too early for you to die. The greatest swordsman in the world announced for all to hear. My name is Dracula Mihawk. Find your true self, your true world, and become stronger. No matter how long it takes, I'll await you at the top. Surpass this sword. Surpass me. Roronoa Zoro. The cooks and pirates picked themselves up and watched in disbelief. Then Zoro announced his intention to do what Mihawk said and lifted his sword, announcing to his captain that he won't lose again. Luffy accepted his words with a grin. Mihawk turned to Luffy, who was looking at his unofficial first mate. So you must be Monkey D. Luffy, he said to him. Luffy tilted his head confused. How do you know that? He asked him. The swordman chuckled. How would I not know? Red-haired keeps talking about you, he told him. Every time I visit him, he tells me about the scary 7-year-old he's met. Luffy laughed sheepishly. Everyone stared at him. So red-haired Shanks knows this boy. Zeph asked himself. Whatever, I'm not really that surprised anymore. Are you going to see him anytime soon? Could you tell him something for me? Luffy then asked. Mihawk considered his words for a moment. The boy was a friend of Shanks. Although the request was a bit annoying, he was sure he'd visit Shanks soon anyway. Finally he nodded. All right, thanks. Tell him that all. Luffy started. Hawkeye's. Don Krieg then interrupted. Didn't you come to take my head? Dracula Mihawk would forever wonder how idiots like this could be pirate captains. How could an East Blue weakling possibly find it a good idea to interrupt the conversation of two men, each of whom was proven to be perfectly capable of pulverizing him with no effort at all, and of whom one was clearly not in the mood to forgive the interruption? Mihawk has to suppress a chuckle as Luffy's entire face twitched in irritation. Give me a minute, Hawkeyes. Luffy spoke in a badly faked calm tone. Mihawk nodded. Luffy unsheathed his sword and slashed forward. Akinami, red wave, he announced, and a light red flying blade attack flew towards Krieg. The Don saw the attack coming, but it was way too fast and it hit him straight on. His armor was barely any help against it as the red wave attack pierced straight through it. What's more, after the attack hit, the armor cracked and most of it fell off. The Don stood for a moment and then fell backwards. The Krieg pirates surrounded their captain and checked his vitals. Then Luffy growled and they looked at him. Get lost, jerks, he yelled at them, and they all fell on their butts. The thought going through their heads was the same one. SS scary. Then he growled again and they panicked and all started jumping in the nearby boat, until they were all in it. Somehow the boat didn't sink. Hey, Luffy yelled at them. You forgot Kong. He kicked Don Krieg at the human pile and he crashed into them, sending many of them into the sea. They quickly got back on the boat and started rowing like crazy to get away. As they were getting away, Luffy felt a presence behind him. It was a stupid-looking large man with various shield on his body. He tried to take him out with a sneak attack. Armament, Luffy murmured. As the large man crashed his fist into his back, the force of his punch was returned to him by Luffy's haki and he was sent flying into the distance. No, Pearl-san, someone yelled from the boat. Hawkeye's sweat dropped. I know now why Shanks thinks this kid is scary. Then Luffy walked back to Mihawk, but did not face him. He looked at the boat with Zoro, Usopp, Yosaku and Johnny. Another twitch formed on his face. "What are you jerks still doing here?" he yelled at them. "Go get Nami or I'll punch you there." They, except Zoro who was resting, too started rowing, while muttering how scary Luffy was. "And you?" Luffy turned to the cooks and they fell on their butts, except for Zeph and Sanji who just sweat dropped. "Do your job. Go make me meat. What is with this kid today?" Sanji thought. Luffy then finally turned to Mihawk who took a step back. "Tell him that I'll enter paradise in about a week." Luffy continued their conversation as though they weren't interrupted in the first place. "Also tell him that I'm counting on him." "What? About what?" Mihawk asked confused. "Just tell him that. He'll know what I mean by that," Luffy answered. Mihawk nodded and took off. Luffy turned around and walked into the restaurant. "Where is my meat?" 15. Anticipation. "I slept so well," Luffy announced when he woke up. He stretched his arms and hit the wall with one, accidentally damaging it a bit. He giggled. Then he jumped off the bed and walked out of the room. He entered the restaurant and looked around. There were costumers here again. "Hey guys," he yelled out. The cooks immediately paled. One of them ran up to Luffy and straightened himself, reporting like a soldier except he didn't salute. "We have your meat ready, sir," he said. "Yay," Luffy exclaimed in joy. The cook looked at him oddly. Then Luffy noticed Sanji, who just brought some costumers some food. "Oh Sanji," he yelled to him. The cook cringed and took a step back, but didn't try to run as he knew it'd make things even more difficult. When he tried that yesterday, Luffy's attempts to recruit him became pretty violent. Luffy," he stuttered and some of the regulars were confused, because they knew how rude Sanji usually was to men. "Will you join me, Sanji?" Luffy asked. Sanji sighed. "We've gone over this, Luffy. I can't join you, I even told you why." Sanji replied. "I won't leave until the old geezer acknowledges me as a good cook." Luffy tried to speak and Sanji flinched. "What is with you guys?" Luffy asked while laughing. "You're acting like I'm some ultra scary guy." "You are," every cook in the room yelled in unison. "I am," Luffy asked, staring dumbfounded. Everyone's sweat dropped. "Anyway, Sanji, after you stormed out yesterday, the old guy said that you are a good cook and he just says you aren't so that you'd leave and follow your dream." Sanji just stared at him in shock. He did. Then something crashed into the restaurant. Sanji, Luffy and a few cooks ran upstairs and saw Yosaku in the mouth of a shark laying on the floor. "Yosaku," Luffy said childishly with a pout. "Why didn't you tell me you were a merman?" Everyone fell over. "He's not a merman," a cook said and slapped him. Luffy looked at him. The cook fell on his butt. The cook's distorted memory. After completely wiping out the Don Krieg pirates and his own pirates, as well as scaring away a Shichibukai, Luffy returned to the restaurant. His eyes darkened and while breathing poisonous fire he yelled, "Where is my meat?" "So scary," the cook muttered, nearly catatonic, while Luffy poked him in the face. A few hours and a cheery goodbye later. "Sanji, make us some food," Luffy yelled, while taking a heroic pose, with his sword in his right hand. "You know, you guys are way too casual for this. Arlong is dangerous," said Yosaku. Sanji snorted. "You're a moron, Yosaku. He may be dangerous, but didn't you see what Luffy did to Don Krieg?" he asked. Yosaku sighed. "Point taken. Hey guys, who's Don Krieg?" Luffy asked after a while without moving from his pose. They both fell over. "The guy at the Baratie Who you beat up," Yosaku yelled. "Oh that guy, I beat that guy up good," Luffy proclaimed proudly. "Serves him right for trying to rest while the rest of the cooks made my meat." They sweat dropped. "What?" asked Yosaku. Sanji lighted himself a cigarette. "He's talking about a cook he beat up after he noticed he wasn't making any food for him," he said and puffed out a smoke. "What?" Yosaku yelled. "Don't you remember the pirates that were there? You know Don Krieg, the pirate." "Huh?" Luffy asked. "But that guy's name wasn't Don Krieg. It's Dracula Mihawk." "No, the other one," Sanji yelled. Luffy looked at him confused. "You mean the one dressed like a yellow trash can?" he asked. Sanji and Yosaku both blinked and blinked again, and then roared out in laughter. After they calmed themselves and Yosaku wiped his tears, he finally asked. Luffy and Ikki, why are you doing a posture? Luffy looked at him like the answer was completely obvious. Well, we need a bronze statue, he proclaimed without moving. Bronze statue, Yosaku repeated, while Sanji face-palmed. Why are you doing a posture though? Well, we don't have one, so I'm trying to fill the part. Luffy said proudly and knocked on his chest, then put his arm back into position. Why would we even need one? Sanji yelled. They watched as Luffy's face became more and more red. Then finally they asked. Why are you all red, Luffy and Ikki? Asked Yosaku. Luffy looked at him and took a deep breath. I tried to think of a reason, but it hurts. Luffy whined. What? Thinking? Sanji asked in a deadpanned expression. Yes, Luffy confirmed. Then both they into the cabin, Yosaku shaking his head and Sanji muttering curses about, stupid shitty captains. When they closed the door, Luffy erupted into laughter. 16. The Superior Fishman Race. Help me, Luffy, Nami said desperately. She tried to get her freedom on her own, but after telling Arlong that she has the money required, he acted quickly and sent Nezumi to retrieve it to stop her from leaving. His plan worked and Nezumi left with the money, leaving Nami desperate. Meanwhile, Usopp was busy trying not get killed, Zoro was cutting random fishmen and trying not to get lost, and Johnny was being completely useless as usual. After learning of Nami's misfortune with Nezumi, the villagers took up their weapons, well, not really weapons, just whatever sharp or large objects they could find. Yosaku and Johnny ran ahead, trying to defeat Arlong out of anger, but which was a mixed blessing since, well, they got beat up but they also managed to prevent the villagers from getting themselves killed. Luffy took his hat from his head and put it on Nami's head. Her crying stopped. She knew the hat meant a lot to him. Keep that safe and follow behind us, he whispered. He walked towards the rest of his crewmates. We're going, he told them. They all stood up. They walked towards Arlong Park together, Luffy in front. Flashback. Luffy stepped over several marine bodies and found the body of Nami, but it was almost completely burned by magma. The only reason he even recognized her was because of her orange hair and clean attack. Luffy gritted his teeth and clenched his fist, unknowingly using armament and making it shiny black. An action that did not go unnoticed by the rest of his crew. As he approached the villagers, who were arguing with the pirate hunters, Luffy finally relaxed a bit, feeling Nami following far behind them. I won't make it repeat itself, Luffy thought. I swear it. Move it, Luffy commanded, and the people moved aside, clearing a path for them. Luffy and the others moved forward, and when they nearly reached, Luffy stopped for a bit. Listen guys, he said quietly. I need each of you to take an enemy down. Arlong has 3 lieutenants, an ideal number. Usopp paled at this, knowing he couldn't avoid fighting. Zoro, you take the fishman with 6 arms. He's a swordsman, but don't kill him. Zoro nodded. Sanji, yours is the guy with weird things on his elbows. You'll know when you see him. Sanji nodded. Usopp, the sharpshooter, cringed. You take the guy with the big lips. Use whatever tricks you have, we aren't white knights. Be careful, the guy is very strong, but you'll be able to take him. Usopp was shaking, but he nodded. All right. Luffy nodded and started walking again. He heard annoying laughter ahead. Armament, he murmured, and without stopping, walked straight through the giant gates, leaving a human-shaped hole in the gates. The 3 straw hats all sweat dropped, and the rest of them had their jaws on the ground. After a second, the gates cracked and collapsed. Arlong and his men blinked several times, trying to determine whether what they saw had indeed happened. Luffy stepped forward with his fist clenched. Which one of you is Arlong? He asked, even though he already knew the answer. Arlong, a tough-looking fishman with a saw-shaped nose, answered. That would be my name. Luffy launched forward and hit Arlong with his fist, sending him flying. The fishman crashed into a stone wall, destroying a part of it. Luffy made sure he didn't use any haki or too much strength. Don't you dare make my navigator cry, Luffy yelled on top of his lungs. Your navigator, Arlong replied mockingly. And who the hell are you, anyway? I'm Monkey D. Luffy, and I'm the future Pirate King, he replied. Pirate King, Arlong repeated. A few of the fishmen nearby snorted. Like a human, like you could become Pirate King. One of them yelled and he along with most other fishmen attempted to attack Luffy, but they were kicked away by Sanji, who just arrived on the scene. "Don't hog all the prey," he told his captain. Then said man sat down on the ground. "What are you doing?" asked Sanji. "I'm letting you take care of things," Luffy announced. He pointed at Arlong. "After you're done, I'm taking care of Ugly Nose over there." "Why you, human bastard?" Arlong yelled, gritting his teeth. "How dare you insult Arlong-sama?" Kurobe yelled out. Luffy just laughed. Sorry, Arpong," Luffy said in a completely insincere tone, mispronouncing the name on purpose. Kurobe jumped to attack Luffy in anger, but was stopped by Sanji's kick. Zoro stepped forward to challenge Hachi. Usopp peeked from the corner of the building, then stepped forward and proudly raised his chest while shaking. "I, the great Captain Usopp-sama will take you on," he announced, took his slingshot and shot Shu. The fishman was angered. "Why you?" he screamed and ran after Usopp, who was already far away from the park. Everyone's sweat dropped. "You know," Sanji begun, "I'm fine with us fighting, but that may be a little too much for Long Nose." Luffy shook his head and waved his hand as if hitting a fly. "Nah," he said, "Usopp can take him. Besides, even if he does get a beating, I'd much rather have him get it sooner rather than later when the enemies will be far deadlier." Zoro and Sanji blinked. Did he just say something smart? They both thought. Then Hachi walked away toward the ocean, much to the confusion of Zoro. He played his trumpet-like octopus mouth. "Moohmoo," he called. After a few moments a gigantic sea cow appeared out of the ocean. "Momu, take care of them," he called out. The sea cow menacingly looked over his targets, until his gaze ended on the boy with the straw hat, who was seated on the stone ground. Its eyes widened. "Hey you," Luffy yelled and waved. "I remember you." Sea cow's memory. Momu was just enjoying swimming around when he smelled something yummy. He swam towards the smell and came across the Bharati. On a balcony on the upper floor of the restaurant, a boy with a straw hat was sitting. He had many plates of meat on the large table. Momu eyed the food hungrily and started drooling. "Why are you looking at my meat?" Luffy asked. He stood up. "You want to steal my food, huh? Get lost, jerk." Luffy yelled at Momu and punched him, sending him flying. Momu started shaking and sweating and then swam away as fast as it possibly could. "What's gone into him?" Luffy asked in a confused tone. Sanji face-palmed, remembering Momu himself. Then they clashed. Luffy watched as Zoro barely kept himself up because of the wounds. Despite this, Hachi clearly had no chance against him and was barely able to touch him. Kurobe and Sanji were somewhat evenly matched. Sanji was faster and was able to dodge all attacks, but Kurobe was stronger and managed to block many attacks using his arms and large elbows. Then Arlong stood up. "Oh Nami, did you come to see me destroy those idiots?" he asked. "Shahahaha." True to his word, Nami stood in front of the villagers. Sanji looked towards her and Kurobe used the distraction to send him flying through the wall with a heavy punch. Zoro did not allow himself to get distracted. "No, Arlong," she replied, holding her shoulder, which Luffy noticed was now bandaged. "I came to see you get beaten." Arlong laughed and as on a cue, Usopp came running back and Sanji slowly stood up and walked toward his opponent while muttering something about punches. "You're stupid, Armbong," Luffy then announced. "My guys are kicking your guys' butts." Sanji, Nami and the villagers couldn't help but smile at the simple words, while Usopp raised his chest proudly and announced that Captain Usopp is the coolest warrior because he finished first. The battles lasted a few more minutes and then Zoro finally finished his fight with Hachi and shortly after that Sanji kicked Kurobe straight through Arlong Park. Then Luffy stood up. "Yosh," he announced in a childish tone. "Now that 6 arms, weird elbows and big lips are finished, I'll be taking Ugly Nose over there." While saying those last words he rudely pointed towards Arlong. The man or rather the fishman was fuming. How dare he? First they kill my comrades, then he insults them. On the outside however, he appeared calm. He jumped towards Luffy, trying to bite him, but Luffy dodged and Arlong bit a column instead. The column cracked and was completely destroyed. Everyone was horrified at his strength, except Luffy, who was instead thinking about the celebration that would follow this. You see this? This is the true strength of a fishman. Humans will never be, Arlong started. Then stop talking and show me. Luffy interrupted him. If fishmen are so great, then you should have no problems with me, now. Arlong gritted his teeth in anger and launched forward. He used all kinds of attacks. He tried to punch, kick, bite and whatever he could think of, but Luffy dodged everything. And rather easily at that. Also, with every strike that missed, Arlong became more and more enraged. Tisk, tisk, tisk. If as a fishman, you're that strong, why are you in the weakest sea then? Luffy asked while dodging, fueling Arlong's anger even further. Shut up, human, he yelled. Also, why haven't you killed any admirals yet then? Luffy asked again in a confused tone as he dodged a vicious-looking kick. I'll kill you, human. I swear I'll kill you, roared Arlong and jumped into the water. Luffy looked at the pool and saw Arlong's fin. Oh, a shark, he yelled excitedly. Everyone fell over. Shark on darts, Arlong announced and jumped out of water, aiming for Luffy's heart with his nose. At first it seemed as if Arlong had succeeded and a few people screamed in horror, but upon closer inspection you could notice that Luffy was holding Arlong's nose with his hand. Get lost, he yelled and threw him into Arlong Park. He crashed into it, but immediately jumped towards Luffy, attempting his signature attack a few more times. You coward, are you dodging because you're scared? He yelled out. Luffy sighed. Idiot. You know, Armlong, as a general rule, I don't like having my chest pierced. Luffy whined. His crew members behind him couldn't help but snicker. The villagers were gawking at them, shocked at what the great tyrant of East Blue had been reduced to. Why you damn human, Arlong yelled and punched him with all his might. Luffy decided to humor him and did not even bother to dodge and instead released a small amount of haki to shield himself. The villagers and crew members watched with their jaws hanging as their hero received a punch to the face and did not budge an inch. Arlong pulled back his fist and stared in horror. I thought superior meant better. Guess I was wrong, Luffy said and scratched behind his ear. I gave you 20 minutes to prove you're better than me. I didn't attack, I didn't use my devil fruit and I barely moved. Guess you were proving something else. Arlong's eyes then changed and he lost whatever restraint he had left. He punched into Arlong Park and grabbed something and pulled it out. Luffy's sweat dropped. That's an interesting way of getting something. Nami's eyes widened in horror. No, Kuribaki, he only uses that when he wants to wreck everything, she yelled. Arlong ran towards Luffy and Luffy jumped up. He crashed into a room in Arlong Park, a room he remembered well. Arlong followed. He had no more restraint left, so he simply slashed left and right. Luffy sidestepped his slashes and Arlong mainly cut Nami's maps. Luffy punched the table out of the room as well as several stacks of paper. What are you doing? He yelled at him. Luffy laughed while dodging. Oh, are you angry, Arlong? Are you? Luffy asked, but then his eyes darkened. But I bet you're not as angry as me. You made my Nakama cry. Then he punched Arlong out of the building. He landed underneath the park, where they fought first. There was map paper all over the plaza. Your Nakama? Arlong asked as he picked himself up. What can you do with her? You can't use her as well as I can. She may be human, but she's got talent. If the rest of humans are like dirty mice, she's like a clever cat. Luffy decided he had enough of him. Armament, he murmured. His arm turned shiny black and he threw a punch at Arlong. He tried to block it with his Kuribaki, but the weapon was broken immediately upon contact and Arlong was sent flying. Everyone watched in awe as Arlong struggled to even get up after that punch. He did not look like someone punched him. Luffy's knuckles were imprinted on his chest and he was spitting blood. Look at your park for the last time, Arlong. Luffy announced and unsheathed his sword. Akinami, red wave. Luffy announced and slashed the air a few times, sending several flying blade attacks towards the building, cutting it cleanly several times. The building collapsed into itself. Arlong looked at it in horror and then he collapsed himself. 17. The pirate with the straw hat. Hey, guys, Luffy yelled. I have something for you. Nojiko, Genzo and a few of the other guys approached Luffy with surprised expressions. What is it, kid? Genzo asked. Luffy handed them the items in his hands. What's this? Flags. Nojiko asked as she looked at them. Luffy nodded. If you hang them in each village, I'm pretty sure it'll keep any pirates away. Luffy told them. Also, Johnny and Yosaku said they would stay here, so they all help protect you if you ask them. Don't be stupid. We can't be protected by a pirate, Genzo stated. Luffy shook his head. Might as well be. The government clearly doesn't give a damn, but they'll at least leave you alone if I claim this island, he told him. Nojiko shrugged. What do you want in return? She asked. Luffy shook his head again with a smile. You already threw us a feast and gave us supplies for the journey. I don't need anything else. A few hours and a weird goodbye later. Nami Swan. 3 inches Sanji announced proudly. Your security guard of love is at your service. Arigato, Sanji-kun. Nami thanked in a sweet voice. Hey, Nami, can I get a tangerine? Luffy asked. Nami's eye twitched. Why should I give it to you? And how do I know you won't take more than one? She asked. Luffy shrugged. Well, you can give me one because I'd like to see what it tastes like, he answered. You've never eaten a tangerine before? She asked. Luffy shook his head. Not that I'd remember, he replied. She stared at him dumbfounded. How do I know you won't steal them all? She then finally asked with half-lidded eyes. Well, then I wouldn't even ask you. I'd beat the crap out of Sanji and take them. Luffy answered in a whiny tone. Hey, yelled Sanji. Then he put his finger on his chin and gained a thoughtful expression. Or maybe I'd use my speed and steal them without anyone noticing, he announced. Or I could steal them at night. Nami abruptly stood up. What? Asked Luffy confused. Why you're actually making sense, she yelled. Luffy tilted his head. Shouldn't I? He asked. But you're Luffy. You're a moron, she told him. I'm not a moron, he yelled in outrage. Oi Nami, Luffy asked after a few moments. What's a moron? Everyone's sweat dropped. Can I get a tangerine now? Luffy asked after a moment. Nami wordlessly walked towards the plant, plucked a good, ripe one and handed it to him. Luffy smiled and peeled the fruit and then ate the fruit slowly, which freaked the girl out. What? He asked again. Why are you eating so slowly? She asked him. He sighed. To enjoy the taste, he asked back. She stared. He ate the last slice, then he laid down. It's good, he announced. A news bird then arrived and Nami stood up, took a newspaper and paid, complaining about the price. She sat down again and opened the newspaper and a paper flew out. Luffy ran after it and picked it up. He grinned as he looked at it. At Marineford, these were all high bounty pirate captains and he took them all out, a green-haired man said and pointed at 3 wanted posters. Easily at that. From what I hear, he wasn't even wounded. Not even once, he continued. And the pirates were formed less than a month ago. Do we have any information on him? A Marine Vice Admiral asked. None, sir, Branu answered. Given his unknown origin, we can't really know how strong he really is yet, but the government has decided on a price. He put a wanted poster with Luffy's smiling face on the wall with the other 3. This bounty is a true record for East Blue. Nobody has ever been given such a high first bounty in East Blue yet, and there are only a few people in other seas who surpass it, most notably perhaps Boa Hancock, Royal Shichibukai and the Demon Child. The government however believes that the figure is reasonable, given how easily he dealt with his enemies. At Marineford, Fleet Admiral's office. Garp walked through a wall into the office. Hey, look at this, Sengoku. Garp yelled and put a wanted poster on his desk. Yes, I already saw this, the head of the Marines said in an irritated expression. Now if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. BWAHAHAHAHA, that's my grandson, Garp proclaimed proudly. Garp, Sengoku said, I'll never get it how you can be proud of such a family. The Marine hero sighed. He's still my grandson, and even if he is a pirate, at least he's a good one. Garp muttered and turned to leave. Use the door next time, Sengoku yelled after him. Garp turned around and huffed. Nope, not cool enough. And then proceeded to close the door of the office and walk through it, leaving another man-shaped hole. Garp, on some unknown island on the Grand Line. Yo, Hawk Eyes, have you come to challenge me to a sword fight? A red-haired man asked. Mihawk shook his head. Perhaps later. I have some things to discuss, he said and revealed a bounty poster. Shanks smiled. After he dueled with me, beat Don Creed with one slash and scared the hell out of everyone else, he told me to be his messenger to a Yonko. Mihawk told him in a totally emotionless tone. Shanks blinked. Gahahaha, just as I expected. He'll surpass even old Shirohige in a few years, Shanks announced. Then he sighed. Honestly, every time I think about that kid I always think that I had to be drunk that whole month. But then Ben always reminds me that it really happened. Shanks continued. So, what's his message? Mihawk sat down next to Shanks. He said that he will enter paradise in about a week, he said. Shanks nodded. That's good to hear. Anything else? He asked. That's the problem, red-haired. He said he is counting on you, but I don't know about what. Hawkeye continued. Shanks laughed and patted his back. Don't worry about it, Hawkeyes. He's just reminding me of something, he said. Now, Hawkeyes, Shanks announced in a fake menacing tone. I can't let you just leave here. On the Moby Dick. Hey, Sabo, come here, yoy. A blonde, pineapple-headed male called out. What is it, Marco? A blonde-haired man with a blue hat and clothes asked and went in his direction. Marco chuckled and handed him a wanted poster. Sabo took it and looked at it. His eyes bulged out. LL Lou Luffy, he stuttered. The amount under his name startled him. What the hell? Marco smirked. Is there a problem, Sabo? He asked. Sabo looked at him dumbfounded. He's got higher first bounty than my and Ace's first bounty combined, he said. Can't wait to tell Ace, yoy, Marco said with an evil expression as he grabbed the poster back. Sabo's sweat dropped. Hey Ace, he yelled. What? A voice asked. Marco turned around and saw Ace. Yo, fireman, he called. A fireman puts out fire, Marco. Ace said with a twitch. I am fire. Whatever. Marco dismissed him. Check this out, yoy. Ace took the poster and looked at it for a full minute. Then he looked at Sabo, then at Marco. Tell me this is a joke, he said. Marco and Sabo blinked in confusion. No, it's real, yoy. Damn it, he was right. Ace muttered. Sabo looked confused. Ace sighed and proceeded to explain. He said, and I quote, your bounties will be tiny compared to mine. He did say that, Sabo confirmed. Ace sighed, but smiled now. I need to show this to Pops, he said and walked away. Slash. A few minutes later. Slash. Look, Pops, Ace exclaimed and practically shoved the poster into Whitebeard's head. This is my little brother. The Yonko took the poster and looked at it. So that's the brat, he said with a quirked eyebrow. Yep, that's my weak little brother, Ace repeated. Whitebeard looked at him in confusion. What? Ace asked. The Yonko coughed. Well, I wouldn't say he was weak, given what is written on this poster. Whitebeard told him. He has a huge first bounty and it says here that he took out the best of East Blue without getting wounded even once. Elsewhere on the ship, Sabo stares at Teach eating a pie and gets an awful sense of foreboding. Marco notices this and comes over to him. What's wrong, yoy? He asked. Sabo shook his head. It's just something Luffy said. He told us to stay away from fat pirates with missing teeth and bushy chest hair that like pies. He raised his hand when an angry Marco tried to say something. No, I'm not joking. He actually said that. Those exact words, Sabo said and Marco stared at him in bewilderment. Well, that seems oddly specific, Marco said with a sweat drop. Did he say why, yoy? Sabo smirked. He said that we should stay away unless we want to get raped. Marco fell over. He actually said that, Marco asked incredulously. When he was 11 no less. Sabo said. Well, Marco said in a deadpan voice as he patted Sabo's shoulder. You sure have one interesting brother. Back on the Going Merry. Check this out guys. Luffy called and turned his wanted poster around so that everyone could see. The crew members, including Zoro who was sleeping only moments ago, all walked towards him and looked at the poster. It read. Monkey D. Luffy, wanted dead or alive. 70.000.000 Berry. 18. Smokey and Dragon. Luffy was snoring with drool coming out of his mouth. Meat, he muttered, but then a boot kicked his head. What? He said and tried to stretch, but he couldn't move. Where am I? Damn it, Seastone, he thought. Gyahahaha. Hey Mugiwara, a high-pitched voice nearby announced. Welcome to the execution. Luffy looked at him and his lips twitched. Even in the face of death he still couldn't resist it. Cool, I've always wanted to see an execution. He beamed. The clown almost fell over. It's your execution, he yelled. What? He exclaimed. No way. He chuckled silently to himself as the clown muttered something about stupidity and straw hats. Now look good, fair Lady Alvida, as I decapitate this bastard. Buggy yelled. He looked down and indeed he saw a skinny Alvida in the front line. Alvida, Luffy repeated. He looked around in every direction. But I don't see any whales, let alone super-sized ones. He had to concentrate hard not to roar out in laughter as he could see Alvida's face get more and more red, before she erupted. I'm not a whale, she yelled. Luffy looked at her and blinked several times. Of course you're not, Luffy told her in a childish tone. You're not Alvida. I am Alvida, bastard. She yelled as a tick formed above her eye. But you're not a whale, Luffy replied. Alvida gritted her teeth in anger. I never was one, she roared out. Now, Lady Alvida, don't mind this brainless idiot. He won't be alive very much longer. Buggy announced and lifted his sword. Die, Straw Hat. This execution, yelled Sanji, is over, finished Zoro. They then fought their way through the pirates, but Luffy knew they were going to be too late. He would have freed himself already, but the Seastone was sapping all of his strength, disabling even his haki. Luffy didn't know if Seastone naturally sapped haki power as well or if it just weakened him too much to use it, but it didn't matter. The sword began to approach his neck. Luffy knew this could very well be the end, if the lighting didn't strike at the right time like the first time. So he smiled. He could see Smoker drop his cigars from his mouth in a building overlooking the plaza and he wondered what that was all about. Usopp, Sanji, Zoro, Nami. He called out. And Chopper, Robin, Brook, Frankie and Vivi. He added in his mind. Sorry, but I'm dead. Then he grinned content and ready to die. And I'm the one dying this time. He thought, and thinking this his grin widened. He was content. All of his Nakama were still alive and he at least saved 4 of them from their otherwise unhappy fates and there was still hope for the rest. But death didn't come and for once Luffy wasn't mad at it. Lighting struck the platform, but Luffy didn't feel anything, only heard it strike. Then the platform collapsed and Luffy fell down with it. Luffy stood up. Maybe Enel saved me, Luffy thought, but then started to snicker. Yeah right. He stepped forward and picked up his straw hat before it hit the ground. He looked at the jaws on the ground and smirked. Well, that was an enlightening experience, Luffy said and then started to giggle. Get it? It's a pun, Luffy told, but nobody would react. You know, enlightening. Luffy tried again. Whatever, Luffy huffed. You're no fun. Then he ran up to Sanji and Zoro and together they ran to the harbor. Zoro was stopped in his tracks by Tashigi. As they ran, Luffy felt a familiar presence. In front of them was none other than Captain Smoker. Smokey, Luffy thought. Flashback. Luffy was sitting on a hilltop, overlooking the ocean. As he thought about his crew again, tears slipped down his face. He felt someone behind him. Mugiwara, a familiar voice said. Luffy turned around. It was Smoker. I came to arrest you, he said, but his attention was clearly not on anything but his face, where tears flowed freely. Then do it, Smokey, Luffy said and faced the sea again. Take me and get this over with. So it's true then? Smoker asked and puffed a smoke. You lost your crew. Luffy didn't answer, but he didn't have to. Smoker knew this answer. Akainu is gone too, disappeared alongside his fleet, and a few vice admirals. What? I killed them, Luffy interrupted. Smoker's eyes widened. You never kill, Mugiwara. He replied. I didn't, but it was already like I was dead myself, so might as well betray my principles too. I didn't care anymore and I still don't, Luffy said, his voice crackling. Smoker turned and left him. That was the last time he saw him. Smoker stepped forward. Mugiwara, he growled. I'm Captain Smoker. You're not getting past me. Luffy stopped. Sanji looked at them. Sanji, Go ahead, I'll follow after I'm done here. Luffy commanded. Smoker smirked. I wouldn't count on it, he told him. Sanji ran forward, but Smoker didn't stop him. He activated his devil fruit power and turned into smoke. Smoke flew in all directions and Luffy noted that Smoker was trying to trap him. This was something he always respected about Smoker. He never really attempted to kill, always only to catch. Luffy activated his Soru for a moment and jumped into air, dodging the smoke that tried to form around him. Smoke followed him. Luffy kicked the smoke away, much to the surprise of his foe. A haki user in the east. Smoker muttered in disbelief. Then he jumped towards Luffy again and attempted to hit him with his jute, but Luffy easily caught his arm. I'm sorry, Smokey, Luffy told him as he gritted his teeth in frustration. But your haki is shitty. Train some more and challenge me again. Smoker growled and tried to strike again, but Luffy punched him hard in the gut. He didn't use too much haki though, as Smoker was one of those rare marines that he truly respected. He dropped the unconscious, but otherwise relatively undamaged Smoker on the ground. He looked at him for a moment, but then he heard footsteps in the rain. He turned around and saw a man, covered in a green cloak, approaching. Lighting flashed and in a moment he could see the man's face. It was covered with tattoos. Flashback. I hear your dad saw you off at Logatown. His name is Monkey D. Dragon. He's a revolutionary. My comrade, Revolutionary Dragon. Son of Dragon. That's your punishment, Mugiwara. For the sin of being born. Dragon, Luffy asked quietly. The man kept walking towards him. Or, should I say, Dad? Luffy continued. The man was now in front of him and they looked at each other. Luffy looked at him with half-lidded eyes. Or maybe the best way to describe you would be sperm donor from hell. Luffy exclaimed after a moment of silence. The man stiffened for a bit, but then started chuckling. You know, if I was Ace, I'd hate you and I'd be trying to kill you right about now. Luffy said. The man paused in his amused laughter. Ace is my brother. Luffy answered the question that was never asked. As is Sabo. Brothers, the man said. You don't have any brothers. Not blood ones, no. Luffy confirmed. The man tilted his head slightly. Ace is in Portgas D. Ace and Sabo as in his crewmember Sabo. He asked. Luffy nodded. The man's eyes widened slightly, but it seemed as if Dragon was used to surprises. So why don't you hate me? The man asked. You have every right to. Luffy sighed. You have done nothing yet. I have no reason to hate you. Luffy answered honestly. The man nodded. Luffy, don't misunderstand me. Luffy interrupted. You aren't a father to me. I don't hate you. It's just that I'm indifferent to you. I don't care about you at all. I don't care about faceless strangers. Quote. But I am your father. Dragon protested. Luffy shook his head. No, you're a stranger, who happens to be the sperm donor. If you want me to care about you, do something to make me care. Quote. Luffy turned to leave, but then turned back for a bit. And for the record, I hate the government too. Luffy said and put his hand on his scar. As he turned around, a wild wind flew forth and carried him and his crew to his ship. Well, it's a start. Luffy thought as he landed on the ship. Dragon stood in the harbor. Damn, that was cold. 19. The Grand Line. Luffy watched into the distance as the ship descended Reverse Mountain. Flashback. You aren't my father. Quote. You're a stranger. I'm indifferent to you, just a sperm donor. He sighed. Zoro noticed his unhappy disposition and put his hand on his shoulder. What's wrong? He asked him. Luffy sighed again. I met my father in Logatown before we left, he told him. Zoro stared at him. For the first time, Luffy added when Zoro obviously didn't know what was the matter. Zoro sighed. I see. He told him. So how did it go? Luffy chuckled softly. I was a total ass to him, he answered after a moment of silence. Zoro blinked. I told him that until he actually does something I don't care about him and see him as a stranger. Luffy continued. Zoro sighed. You were a jerk, yes. Zoro confirmed. But I honestly can't blame you. I'd probably do worse and smack him a few times and. Hate to interrupt your bonding, but we're about to crash. Nami interrupted. Luffy looked ahead and saw what looked like a giant mountain. Shit, Laboon, thought Luffy. He was unable to stop the figurehead from breaking off and went pretty mad there for a moment. Then the whale swallowed the ship and he entered the whale through a hatch on the top. Then he found his way to the stomach and almost fell in it. 2 people who were apparently inside with him did fall in it. He rocketed himself into the ship just as Zoro was being restrained to not kick the crap out of Crocus for some reason. He crashed into them. Sanji managed to grab himself into the fence, but Zoro was thrown over it, straight into the whale's digestive juices while displaying his colorful mastery of curse language. Yuck. Then 2 people climbed over the railing. One was a brown-haired man in green clothes with a crown on his head and the other was a blue-haired girl. Flashback. Why do you sit there, Luffy-san? Isn't it dangerous? You're a devil fruit user. It's my special seat. Don't worry, I won't fall. Only right now, she wasn't acting anything like that. She seemed like the typical Baroque Works agent. Luffy didn't know whether it was a facade or the influence of her partner, who was actually quite annoying. They acted like they owned their boat and attempted to kill Laboon with their bazooka. Crocus intercepted their attack. Luffy wondered how the old man was able to do that without getting heavily injured. He seemed normal enough to him. Luffy then knocked them both out. After a few minutes of talking with Crocus, who explained about Laboon to them. Then they exited the whale's stomach. After a while, Luffy proceeded to fight with Laboon and then painted a deformed Straw Hat Jolly Roger on his front to stop him from damaging his head any further. After a few minutes of conversations, Nami was eyeing her compass with a bewildered expression. Luffy lied on the grass of the small island near Laboon and watched the sky. Usopp was on the ship fixing things. Zoro was there, sleeping. Sanji arrived, carrying food. Here's your food, Nami Swan. Sanji exclaimed and twirled around in his love noodle form, whilst still carrying the plates, which always impressed Luffy. Hey, Sanji-kun, the compass seems to be broken. She told him. Sanji put his plates down and looked at it. Luffy started eating. You're right, Nami-san. It's spinning randomly. He added. Crocus laughed from his chair and everyone looked at him, except Luffy, who was eating Nami's food. That simple compass won't get you anywhere in the Grand Line, he told them. Nami looked at him with a horrified expression. The nature here in paradise and even more so in the New World is far too unpredictable for such a simple thing as a compass to work. Then what do we need? Asked Nami. Crocus chuckled. You didn't come very prepared, did you, young lady? He asked in an amused tone. You're going to need a log pose. This is serious, why are you laughing? Nami yelled at him. Crocus pointed at Luffy's hand which was offered to Nami, holding an actual log pose. Those weirdos dropped it. Nami took the log pose and simultaneously punched Luffy, who of course wasn't really affected but whined nonetheless. Why did you punch me, Nami? He asked childishly. Nami huffed. Just because. She said. Luffy pouted. Whatever. He told her and stuck his tongue out. You punch like a girl. I am a girl. She shouted and proceeded to punch him, but before she could, Sanji got angry on her behalf. Why you shitty rubber, he yelled. First you eat my Nami-san's food and then you insult her. And then he kicked him in the head, which did absolutely nothing of course except make a small red mark on Luffy's face. Sanji-kun, Nami suddenly muttered in a dark, menacing tone that promised death. Luffy and Sanji both looked at her and noticed that the log pose had broken from the wind of the kick. Sanji tried to plead innocent, but Nami would have none of it and proceeded to beat the crap out of him. Luffy laughed as she did so, but as Sanji laid on the ground in a heap, Nami turned his attention to him and approached him in a pitch-dark but also somewhat gloomy aura. As for you, monkey boy, she muttered darkly. Luffy's sweat dropped. As she neared him, he put his hand up. Wait, Nami. He told her in a calm tone. Nami stopped out of confusion. He didn't sound like he was making an excuse or trying to prevent being beaten. Wait a second, Nami. He said and opened one of his pockets. He pulled out a box, which although not very big still barely fit in his pocket. I hope it's still okay after all that, he thought and put the box on the ground. Opened it. Everyone looked at it. Inside the box was a small knife with an exquisitely shaped handle, a small badge with the Straw Hat Jolly Roger, which Luffy didn't ever wear for some reason, a few other objects and another very small box, a bit bigger than the size of the kind of box where you'd put an engagement ring or something like that. Luffy took it and gave it to her. She opened it and gasped. Inside it was another log pose. She then proceeded to hug Luffy, at which he sweat dropped. Women and their mood swings. He thought. The hypocrite that he has given his own demon persona. She looked at Luffy, then at the log pose and then at Luffy again. What? He asked in a deadpanned expression. You actually came prepared, Nami almost screamed. Luffy just looked at her confused. Don't look at me like that. She yelled at him, but then calmed a bit and sighed. It's just that it seems so unlike you. You never plan your battles. You don't care about our food stocks and just eat everything in sight. And you didn't even have a ship when we first met or any crew members or nothing. Nami, Luffy replied in his, "You're very stupid and here's why," tone. Firstly, I only had 18 million berry when I set out. That's not enough for any kind of ship. Secondly, I don't need to plan against weaklings, and thirdly I always eat until I'm full. Gramps taught me to do that. Nami and Sanji stared at him dumbly. What's happening? He's making sense again. After more conversations, repairs, naps, begging from Vivi and Mr. 9 as well as setting sail. After a lesson in Grand Line weather, much to Luffy's hidden amusement, when it finally stopped snowing and they were relaxing on the deck, even the guests, Luffy came from the storage room of the ship with a few bandanas and wooden sticks. They all looked at him and got a terrible feeling. Luffy, what are you? Nami started. Time for haki training, guys. Luffy interrupted. Everyone blinked. The what training, Luffy? Zoro asked on the other's behalf. Haki, Luffy said, but as they still looked at him, still confused, Luffy proceeded to explain. Oh, that's right. You don't know about it yet. So let me explain. He sat down on the wooden ground, put down his items, and everyone came over to him. As they sat down in a circle, Vivi and Mr. 9 sat down next to the railing, intrigued by the mysterious haki, but didn't want to come closer. Luffy sighed. Haki is sort of like weaponized ambition. My sensei told me that it's present in all people, but few manage to get it out. Luffy told them. They listened intently. My sensei called haki the act of not doubting. He said that is true strength. The act of not doubting. Zoro repeated dumbfounded. Luffy nodded. Those who have no doubts, fight better, he told them. Zoro and Sanji nodded, knowing this to be true. That's also why people who are already strong or strong-willed normally learn it faster. So what can haki do? Usopp asked. Plenty of things. Luffy began. Increase your strength, protect your body, reflect attacks, better avoid attacks and other things. They all looked at him in bewilderment. Then haki is incredibly useful, Zoro concluded. They all nodded, but Luffy shook his head. Now it's useful, he said. But as we get deeper and deeper into the Grand Line, it'll become a must. But how will those things help us train haki? Zoro asked and pointed at the bandanas and sticks. Luffy shook his head again. First let me tell you more about it. There are 3 forms of haki, as I've said, he said. Zoro nodded again. First, observation haki. It allows you to feel the presence of beings and things around you. Luffy said and stood up. He turned away from them and closed his eyes. They looked at him confused. Zoro, he called, try to cut me. The swordsman looked at everyone. They shrugged, so Zoro took out Wado Ikimonji and attempted to cut Luffy several times. He dodged every attempt with minimal movement, much to their amazement. Luffy then turned back to them and continued. It only works as long as your concentration is good enough and as long as your enemy's strikes aren't random, he told them. That's amazing. Usopp gasped out. Luffy smiled. The second is armament haki. It basically shields your body. It allows you to make your attacks more powerful, shield your body from harm and bypass devil fruit defenses. Devil fruit defenses? Nami asked. Luffy nodded. If you had haki and hit me and my own haki didn't shield me, I'd feel the same pain as if I wasn't rubber, he said. Suge, Usopp said. Luffy looked at Sanji. Kick me, once, he ordered. Sanji blinked, but then stood up. Luffy held the wrist of his right hand with an open palm with his left hand. The palm of the hand was opened in the direction of Sanji. I don't know how good this explanation is, but think about Sentomaru if you're confused. Sanji kicked him and Luffy caught his leg with his palm and Sanji was blasted away, almost crashing into Zoro. Stupid Dartbrow, Zoro muttered. Luffy tried not to laugh. This was the first time he had heard Zoro insult Sanji in this timeline. What did you say? Sanji asked in a threatening tone. Marimo. Stop. Luffy ordered and Sanji finally sat down. Both were still glaring at each other. Luffy would have loved to see them fight actually, but this was too important to delay. I saw your arm turn black a few times. Was that armament haki? Zoro asked. Luffy smiled. Yes, actually, but it's a little bit different. Instead of making armor around my skin, I make skin into armor. If that makes any sense. Luffy said. Then he put his left hand in a fist and muttered, armament, and the hand turned shiny black like it was supposed to. Why do you always say, armament? Zoro asked. Luffy's sweat dropped. Why do you say, Santoryu, every time? Luffy asked back. Good point. Anyway, the last type is the haki of the conquering king. Our king's disposition, Luffy said and sat down. Only 1 in a million are supposed to have it. It's a chosen people kind of thing. How do you know if you can use it? Usopp asked. Luffy shrugged. Honestly, you just get stronger and hope it shows along the way, he answered. Aren't you going to show us? Zoro asked. Luffy shook his head. No, even if it would work, it's not worth it. It's pretty unpleasant, Luffy told them. Why? Zoro asked. It allows you to overpower the minds of other people. Luffy answered and the others looked at him in shock. Your targets need to be both weak-willed and much weaker than you for it to work. It's good for dealing with weaklings. What does it do? Sanji asked. It literally breaks the minds of your enemies for some time and they collapse. That can't feel too good. Luffy answered and scratched his head. Nami was hit by a sudden realization. You used it on those 3 pirates in Orange Town, she said and pointed at him. Luffy nodded, but then he stood up, ignoring their shocked faces because of him being one of the chosen ones, and picked up his training equipment. We'll start with observation, he announced. They looked at him confused. He grinned. Nami will be paired with Usopp and Sanji will go with Zoro since you're closer in strength that way, he said. What will we do? Usopp asked and as Luffy grinned they got another terrible feeling. One of you will blindfold himself and sit on the ground and try to dodge the other's hits with the bat. You'll repeat that a few hours every day until you can dodge flawlessly. Luffy said in a cheerful tone. WHAAAAT. They all yelled. Happy training. 20. Observations at Whiskey Peak. A few people walked over Luffy waking him up. He lifted himself and his enlarged stomach up and scratched his head in confusion. Where am I? He asked himself. Then he looked around and saw his nakama, except Zoro and Nami on the ground, sleeping. Flashback. Welcome to Whiskey Peak, great pirates. We make a party for anyone who makes it this far, so congratulations to you all. Please, follow me and make sure you enjoy yourselves. Right, Luffy whispered to himself as he remembered. He noticed his large belly was dirty from their footsteps and he cleaned himself a bit after standing up. He heard screaming. Where the hell is he? Multiple people shout, a bit panicked. Luffy could sense Zoro's aura flicker. He walks towards the door and immediately runs into a man. The man tries to shout to alert others, but Luffy covers his mouth with his hand to prevent him, but then the man swings his sword and very nearly cuts Luffy's large stomach. He then punches the man in the gut and stops his body just as he's about to hit the ground and sets him on the ground quietly. He walks out of the building quietly, careful not to attract any attention. He then checks the top of the house with his observation haki and is glad to notice that there's nobody on it. Good. He thought and jumped up on a building, landing softly, but very nearly falling over as he did. Damn stomach. He thought. Getting in the way. Then he got an idea. I did that once in Impel Down. I should be able to repeat it, even though I don't need the energy. He used his rubber powers to get rid of his big stomach, relocating the energy in other parts of his body. He gritted his teeth in pain. Damn, I don't remember this being so painful, he thought with a pout. He looked down at the battlefield. Zoro was speeding past foes, slashing them when he passed. It was abundantly clear the poor agents had no chance. Damn, Luffy thought as he followed Zoro's carnage with pride. It's hard to believe that we were already this good when we barely even entered the Grand Line. Agaram, who Luffy was surprised to see was trying to kill Zoro, forced his unofficial first mate to jump away in order to avoid getting hit by the weird shotgun thing. Zoro proceeded to sheath his white katana and unsheathed Yubashiri, one of the blades he was gifted with. He ran into a few enemies and cut them. Nice katana. It's light and easy to wield. Luffy heard him comment. He furrowed his brows. Complete opposite of that black blade. What was it, Shisui or something like that? Zoro then unsheathed his other new blade, Sandai Kidetsu. Immediately upon doing that, Luffy flinched. He sensed a very dark but also a bit mischievous presence from the blade, and this surprised him. Why do I feel this sword's presence now and I couldn't ever before? He thought to himself, but then I'd Ashita no Kaneshimi. Is it because I've become a bit of a swordsman myself? Zoro then cut a few more enemies, and Luffy noticed that his swings with Kidetsu were far deadlier and may have actually outright killed a few, which rarely happened before with Zoro's level of restraint. When he stopped, Zoro clutched the shoulder of the hand that held Kidetsu as if in pain. Damn, what overwhelming bloodlust. Luffy could hear Zoro say. A Mato is only supposed to cut when its master commands. This caught the attention of nearby foes and Zoro was forced to flee on top of a building. He climbed ladders and went as far as he could go until he was on top. Luffy watched with amusement as Zoro pushed away the ladder, throwing away a dozen or so enemies. Zoro then jumped across to the other side, using the falling ladder to be able to do so. As Zoro landed on the rooftop, he looked somewhat like some sort of a grim reaper with a sword in each hand and a somewhat demonic look to his face. Luffy then turned away as he felt a relatively weak, but familiar aura flicker. He looked to his left and saw Nami exiting a small building, stuffing a few money notes in her pocket and running to another house. He grinned. As he turned his attention back to Zoro, he couldn't see him anywhere in sight, but he still sensed his presence. He heard a distinctly female voice scream something. Luffy assumed it was an attack name. He watched as the three agents assumed the battle was over and he gritted his teeth in annoyance, still clearly feeling Zoro's aura, as powerful as ever. This is insulting. How dare they assume that my first mate was defeated so easily? He thought to himself. On the first island no less. Jerks. But to his captain's pleasure, Zoro soon proved them wrong by defeating the powerful-looking girl who seemed to have defeated him only moments before. The three remaining agents looked at Zoro in silence for a few moments, but then the one they called Mr. 8 got a look of sudden realization. I see now, he announced, and the remaining Baroque Works agents looked at him. The Marines must have made a mistake. The bounty must really belong to this guy. He must be the captain. The rest nodded, agreeing with his conclusion. Luffy was beyond annoyed. That's right, Mr. 9 agreed. I should have known that there was no way for such a smiley-faced kid to get such a high bounty. Or to be the captain. Smiley-faced kid. Luffy scowled in annoyance. People who judge their enemies on their appearance alone don't usually live very long on the Grand Line. But then he smirked and sat down on the edge of the roof. Time to teach them something. Yo, Zoro, he called out and waved, interrupting them just as they were about to brag about their number agent status. Everyone looked at him, including Zoro, who was a tad surprised that he was up. When you deal with the trash, come have a drink with me, he announced. Zoro smirked. Sounds good, Captain, he replied after a moment. This earned horrified stares from the group down below. Why, you're not the captain, stuttered Miss Wednesday at Zoro. Luffy face-palmed in disappointment. Even you, Vivi. Luffy saw Zoro smirk in amusement for a moment at his own irritation with them, but then the first mate spoke up. We're the Straw Hat Pirates, idiots. Do you see a straw hat anywhere on my head? Then the battle continued. A few of the men remaining tried to sneak up on Luffy, but he flung them off the roof, sending them head first into the street below. What remained of them was their legs dangling out of the cement, struggling to free the rest of their bodies. Zoro dealt with the three remaining threats easily enough. The rest weren't even considered as threats to Zoro by Luffy, and Luffy was well entertained by them. Between Mr. 9 and Vivi's incompetence, which he laughed at heartily, Zoro's demonic presence and Mr. 8's odd fighting style, Luffy was kept entertained every second. In the end, when a garum finally fell, Luffy clapped in joy. "Great job, Zoro," Luffy said and outstretched his arm to him. Instead of grabbing it, as Luffy expected, Zoro jumped on it and ran on the leg until he reached its roof, at which point he jumped out. He probably didn't trust Luffy to pull him up. Luffy then offered Zoro sake, which he gladly accepted. "You're strong," Luffy finally said after a moment of silence and quiet drinking. Zoro snorted and looked at him. "That's odd, coming from you," Zoro replied. Luffy shook his head. "It's hard to put things into perspective sometimes," Luffy said after another moment of silence. He felt another familiar aura approaching him, but he didn't comment on it. A normal man is plenty strong, but he so very easily dies or is beaten. Then there are stronger men, like Morgan and Django and such, who seem to tower over men. Then there are the likes of Mr. 8 over there, but even they aren't any match for monsters such as you or Sanji. Zoro chuckled, probably finding it funny for Luffy to call him a monster and not the other way around, but remained quiet. After them are people such as government agents, who've trained for their whole lives and dwarf over complete monsters. Then those walking weapons are no match at all for powerful vice admirals, new world captains and the like. Zoro continued to listen silently and poured himself more sake. But even they are humbled by the Shichibukai and Yonko's closest lieutenants. And yet, as dreadful as they may seem, there are still people above them. The Yonko, admirals, Mihawk. Quote. Zoro stiffened a bit and touched his scar, which was finally healing properly. "And me," Luffy concluded. Zoro stopped drinking and looked at him. "But even we aren't on top, oh no," Luffy continued. Zoro looked at him oddly. "But you're on par with an admiral," Zoro exclaimed. "You're the strongest there is." Luffy shook his head. "As strong as we are still no match for the old legends, the jerks from the old era. The ones truly on top are Whitebeard, Fleet Admiral Sengoku and, well, Gramps." Luffy finished. Zoro looked at him wide-eyed. "Garp, he's that strong?" he asked. Luffy nodded. "He is." "So, what are you trying to say?" Zoro asked jokingly. "If it's that you're horribly strong, I already knew that, but thanks." Luffy shook his head and snorted in amusement. "I wonder how all this is possible," he said. "Monsters who tower over monsters who tower over monsters who tower over monsters who too." "I get the idea," Zoro interrupted, irritated. "What's your point?" Luffy looked at him. "Zoro, you're the strongest swordsman of East Blue and yet you're nothing to a guy like, say, Doflamingo," he told him. Zoro stiffened a bit at the blunt words. "But, Whitebeard would literally walk over that guy. It's screwed up, completely mad. I don't know how everything even works." "Well, those were some enlightening words, Captain," a female voice said from behind. "Can't say I've expected that from you." "Hi, Nami," Luffy greeted. Zoro turned around startled. "Since when were you here?" he asked her. She opened her mouth to answer. "Since I started talking," Luffy answered for her. "Observation haki," Luffy said after they looked at him oddly. Luffy invited Nami to sit beside them and gave her a glass of sake. She drank a bit, but then they heard talking. "You see, certain members of a certain kingdom seem to have infiltrated our organization," a black-haired man said with an arrogant voice. "And so we were sent to eliminate them." Mr. 8 and Mrs. Wednesday seemed to sweat a bit upon hearing this. "I'm not a king," Mr. 9 protested. "It's just my style. You can't." "We didn't mean you, idiot," the blonde-haired agent with an umbrella said in irritation. Then the black-haired agent, Mr. 5, pulled out a picture. This caused Mr. 8 to react violently and he attacked the duo with his odd weapons. "As the captain of guard of Arabasta, I won't let you do this," he yelled. The agent duo was unharmed. "Captain of Arabasta Royal Guard, Agarum and Princess of Arabasta, Nefertari Vivi," Mr. 5 announced. Nami spat out her sake. "She's a princess," Zoro announced. Nami's eyes turned into berries, at which both men's sweat dropped. "You know what that means, guys. We're rich if we save her. Go save her, guys." "You know, they tried to kill us," Zoro protested. Nami would have none of it. "I'll get my billion berry, Zoro. If not from her, then from you," she almost yelled at him. "And I think she would pay much more easily than you." $1 billion is not that much for a kingdom to pay. Luffy stood up and they both looked at him in confusion. You can get a lot of meat with $1 billion berry, he announced. They both fell over, but Nami got over her shock quickly enough. See, Luffy understands, she said with a smile. Luffy turned to Zoro. Go deal with them, I'll take the Vivi to safety, he told him. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment and subscribe, as well as checking out the author on fanfiction.net.